Hey guys, Dimension Master Studios here. How y'all doing? So, if you guys have been watching my channel for a while, then I'm sure as you guys know, for me personally, I really like Season 11. In my opinion, Season 11 is one of the best seasons in all Ninjago, and I feel like this season overall did a lot of really great things for the Ninjago franchise. However, there's one aspect about Season 11 that I personally really enjoy that I haven't really talked about that much on my channel, and that is the storytelling. The storytelling of Season 11, in my opinion, is genuinely fantastic, mainly because Season 11 does a lot of subtlety and nuance when it comes to its storytelling, and in today's video, I wanted to take a look at 3 great examples of subtle storytelling done during the Fire chapter and the Ice chapter in order to properly explain why I personally really enjoy the storytelling of Season 11. So, let's get into this whole thing. So, when it comes to the Fire chapter, the great storytelling of this season starts off at the very beginning of the season with Zane's vision. Now, when it comes to Zane having visions, this is something that we hadn't seen in the show for a very long time. In fact, the last time that we had ever seen anything when it came to Zane's visions was back during Season 4 when he had visions of the Titanium Dragon. And prior to that, the last time that Zane had a vision was back during Season 1 with the Green Ninja. And in both of those scenarios, Zane's vision was meant to act as foreshadowing for something that would happen later on during the season, and the same thing holds true for Season 11. Because when it comes to Zane's vision during the first episode of the season, it's meant to foreshadow a ton of things that would later happen during the events of the season. Stuff like Asphira's return and her invasion of Ninjago City as well as the monastery, and Zane becoming the Ice Emperor and the horrible stuff that he would do in the Neverrealm. But there's one other thing that I want to point out. At the end of Zane's vision, we get this shot of all the ninja being frozen in ice, and one of those ninja is Lloyd, and when it comes to Lloyd being frozen in ice, that happens during the final episode of the Ice chapter, foreshadowing that as well. Moving on from this, the next bit of storytelling that we get happens during the episodes Ancient History and Never Trust a Human, with both of these episodes revealing Asphira's backstory. And what we learn about Asphira's backstory is very interesting. During the episode Ancient History, this episode reveals that Asphira was initially a good person until she met a boy who gave her the scroll of forbidden spinjitzu and corrupted her, transforming her into a villain. And this is something that I find to be pretty interesting because the show initially sets up the idea of Asphira being a sympathetic antagonist, with her initially being a good person before she gets corrupted and she becomes a bad guy. However, it's later revealed during the episode Never Trust a Human that this isn't the case. And instead, when it comes to Asphira, she was actually a bad guy the entire time and she manipulated Wu into teaching her how to use spinjitzu. But still, I find it interesting that when it comes to the show, it set up the idea of Asphira being a sympathetic antagonist, only for it to be revealed that that wasn't the case, which I think is an interesting bait and switch. However, there's a couple other things about Asphira's backstory that I want to talk about. When it comes to Asphira's backstory that we learn about during the episode Never Trust a Human, there are some interesting parallels between it and what we see happen with Lloyd and Harumi during Season 8. When it comes to both Lloyd and Wu, the two of them both ended up meeting a girl who they thought that they were friends with, and both of them ended up getting along well with that girl, only for it to ultimately be revealed that the girl was actually using them the entire time in order to get something that they wanted. When it came to Harumi, that was the Mask of Hatred, and when it came to Asphira, that was knowledge on how to use spinjitzu, and the girl would ultimately betray both Lloyd and Wu respectively, and as it turns out, when it came to Harumi and Asphira, they weren't actually friends with Lloyd and Wu respectively, and they actually didn't like them. And so again, this is something that I think is pretty interesting, seeing the parallels between Lloyd and Harumi and Wu and Asphira. Now granted, there are definitely differences between these two stories, like for example, when it comes to Harumi, she manipulated Lloyd into having feelings for her, which is something that we never saw with Asphira and Wu, but still, I think it is interesting seeing the parallels between these two different stories playing out during the events of the show. But finally, there's one last interesting thing that I want to point out when it comes to Asphira's backstory, and it's that when it comes to the backstory that we're presented with during the episode Ancient History, this ends up being the backstory for the Ice Emperor. Remember, when it comes to the backstory that we're initially presented with for Asphira, we learned that Asphira was a good person until she met a boy who gave her the scroll of forbidden spinjitzu and corrupted her, thus transforming her into a villain. And during the episode Corruption, we get a chance to see the Ice Emperor's backstory, and during that episode, we get a chance to see Zane, who was a good person, end up meeting Vex, who gave him the scroll of forbidden spinjitzu and corrupted him, thus transforming him into a villain. And so this is something that I think is really interesting, because like I said earlier, the show initially set up the idea of Asphira being a sympathetic antagonist, only for it to be revealed that that wasn't the case and she was always a bad person. However, the backstory that we're initially given for Asphira ends up being the eventual backstory for the Ice Emperor, so in a way, you could view the initial backstory that we're given for Asphira as foreshadowing for the backstory of the Ice Emperor, with him being an actual sympathetic antagonist for the show, which I honestly think is something that's legitimately very interesting. But finally, there is one last moment of storytelling that I want to go over when it comes to the Fire chapter, and that is the mirror scene. Now, the mirror scene is a moment that we get during the episode The Explorers Club, and when it comes to this moment, it's effectively meant to act as foreshadowing for the storylines of Lloyd, Nia, and Zane during the Ice chapter. When it comes to this moment, all three of these characters find a mirror in the Explorers Club, and all of them look at it, and this mirror ends up reflecting their worst fears. Lloyd sees himself becoming like Garmadon and him becoming a bad guy, Nia sees herself becoming an ordinary person who never unlocked her elemental powers, and Zane sees himself becoming a machine with no humanity or soul at all, only programming and code. So that's already something pretty interesting. However, Season 11 does something really interesting, because when it comes to both Zane and Nia, they both end up becoming their worst fears during the events of the Ice chapter. Meanwhile, Lloyd doesn't. When it comes to Zane, he ends up becoming the Ice Emperor, who ends up getting controlled by the Scroll of Forbidden Spinjitzu's corruption, as well as Vex's lies and manipulation, meaning that when it comes to Zane, he ended up becoming a machine that just followed orders with no humanity or soul at all. When it comes to Nia, though, she ended up not being able to use her powers for a majority of the Ice chapter, with all of the water in the Neverrealm being turned into snow and ice, thus resulting in Nia becoming an ordinary person who didn't have access to her powers. So again, that's already something pretty interesting, seeing these two becoming their worst fears, but like I said, when it comes to Lloyd, this isn't the case. Because when it comes to Lloyd, the season initially sets up the idea of Lloyd becoming a bad guy. We see that during the episode Secret of the Wolf, with Lloyd becoming more antagonistic towards Akita during that episode, with Lloyd jumping to conclusions and him assuming that Akita is going to hurt him just because Harumi did that in the past. However, when it comes to Lloyd, he doesn't become a bad guy because Lloyd's able to overcome his trust issues and he learns to see the good in the world again. When it comes to Lloyd, as a result of him traveling with Akita, he's able to work through the trauma that he went through during the events of the Yoni trilogy, and he's able to find a way to overcome it, thus preventing him from becoming a bad guy, which I think is honestly something pretty interesting. Again, it set up the storylines of these three different characters for the Ice chapter, but what's even more interesting is that when it comes to Zane and Nia, while these two did ultimately become their worst fears during the events of the Ice chapter, Lloyd was able to prevent himself from becoming a bad guy, and he was able to prevent himself from becoming his worst fear. Moving on from this though, let's talk about the Ice chapter, and honestly, I could make an entire video dedicated to the amazing storytelling of the Ice chapter, but for the sake of time, I'm only going to be taking a look at three things in this video, with the first thing being Vex. Now, when it comes to Vex, he serves a very interesting role in the story. When it comes to Vex, he's initially set up as being the second in command of the Ice Emperor and nothing more. That is, however, until it's revealed later on during the season that Vex is actually the one responsible for turning Zane into the Ice Emperor in the first place, and when it comes to Vex, he is the true main antagonist of the Ice chapter. Now, that's already something pretty interesting. However, Vex ends up serving another very interesting role in the story, and that is him serving as a dark reflection of both Lloyd and Akita at different points during the storyline. When it comes to Lloyd, this is something that's seen more all throughout the events of the Ice chapter. Now, earlier I talked about that when it comes to Lloyd, when he looked into the mirror, he saw himself becoming like Garmadon, and he saw himself becoming a villain, and that is what Vex is meant to represent. Vex is meant to represent a dark reflection of Lloyd, showing what Lloyd could end up like if he gives in to all of his paranoia and his trust issues. However, as a result of Lloyd overcoming those trust issues and him learning how to see the good in the world again, Lloyd is able to prevent himself from ending up like Vex. Meanwhile, when it comes to Akita, though, this is something that we see during the episode Last of the Formlings. During that episode, we learn that when it comes to Akita, she has a lot of anxiety revolving around her finding her animal form, and she's worried that she may not find her animal form, and she's worried about what might happen to her if she isn't able to find it. And during the episode, we get a chance to see why Akita is so worried, because during that episode, we learn that Vex was initially from the Formling tribe, and he wasn't able to find his animal form, thus resulting in him becoming really bitter and angry towards the world. And when it comes to Akita, she's worried that if she doesn't find her animal form, then she'll end up exactly like Vex, and she'll also become very bitter and angry towards the world. However, this does not happen because Akita is ultimately able to find her animal form, and she's able to work through her anxiety, and she's able to overcome it, thus resulting in her not ending up like Vex. And that's essentially a major thing that we see when it comes to the Ice chapter, and that's different characters potentially becoming like Vex, only for that to not happen, which I think is honestly something really interesting. Moving on from this, another bit of storytelling that I want to talk about is the Never Realm itself. Now, at the beginning of the Ice chapter, we learn that when it comes to the Never Realm, it is stuck in an eternal winter. And as we see all throughout the events of the Ice chapter, the Never Realm has this really dark and melancholic feel to it, with essentially this feeling of darkness, despair, and no real hope. And this is something that's very interesting because the state of the Never Realm is actually meant to reflect Lloyd's state of mind during the events of the Ice chapter. Following the events of the Oni trilogy, Lloyd wasn't in a very good position in his life as a result of Harumi's betrayal and Lloyd having trust issues and him not being too sure about who he was able to trust outside of members of the team. And the Neverrealm is meant to reflect just that. The Neverrealm is meant to reflect Lloyd's dark outlook on the world and him having a very melancholic feel at this point in his life. However, by the time the Ice chapter ends up coming to an end, we see that the Eternal Winter is ended as a result of Zane destroying the scroll of Forbidden Spinjitzu, and now when it comes to the Neverrealm, there is a much more positive and happy future for it, given that the Eternal Winter isn't around anymore. And this, yet again, is meant to reflect Lloyd's state of mind, with him having a much more positive outlook on the world following his experiences in the Neverrealm and him learning to overcome his trust issues and him learning to see the good in the world again. Which I think is honestly something really interesting to see, an entire realm that's meant to reflect the state of mind of one of the characters in the show. I think that's honestly something really cool. But now, there is one last piece of storytelling that I want to talk about when it comes to the Ice chapter, and this is something that I have brought up in so many of my videos. But for the last bit of storytelling that I want to go over when it comes to not just the Ice chapter, but Season 11 as a whole, it is the Ice chapter recreating certain moments from Season 8. This is something that we see on 3 different occasions during the Ice chapter, specifically during the episodes Secret of the Wolf, The Last of the Formlings, and Awakenings. And when it comes to all 3 of these moments, they're all meant to be recreations of certain moments that we saw with Lloyd and Harumi during the events of Season 8. But when it comes to these moments, they're done with Lloyd and Akita instead. And when it comes to this, it's meant to be symbolic. It's meant to show that when it comes to Lloyd and Akita, the storyline that these two are going through is very similar to what happened with Lloyd and Harumi. However, not everything is exactly the same, and there are differences between both of these storylines. And this is something that can be seen when it comes to both these stories. Given that when it came to the stuff with Lloyd and Harumi, that revolved around Harumi doing whatever she could to hurt Lloyd and make him suffer, and Lloyd going through a ton of trauma and pain as a result of that. Meanwhile, when it comes to the stuff with Lloyd and Akita, it revolves around the two of them healing from the trauma that they went through, and the two of them learning to overcome their trust issues, and them learning to see the good in the world again, and them learning to let go of certain ideas that they have been holding on to. I go over this a lot more in my big review of Season 11, so I highly recommend that you check that out. But again, when it comes to this, I think it's honestly really interesting to seeing Season 11 recreating certain moments from Season 8 and using those recreated moments in order to show the similarities between both of these stories. I think it's honestly something really cool to see. And so that's pretty much all I got for you guys. When it comes to season 11, I honestly feel like this season does a really great job at telling its story, because like I said earlier, I feel like the season does a nice job at telling its story in more subtle and nuanced ways in comparison to a lot of other Ninjago seasons, and I feel like the subtle storytelling that we see during season 11 is genuinely fantastic, and in my opinion, when it comes to season 11, this season honestly gave us some of the best storytelling that we had ever seen when it comes to the franchise. I genuinely think it's really great. And so that's pretty much all I got for you guys. So tell me down below, what do you guys think? Tell me, what are your guys' thoughts on the storytelling of Season 11? And also tell me, do you guys want me to make a video just dedicated to the storytelling of the Ice chapter? Please tell me down below, and I hope you guys enjoy. Later guys, this is Dimension Master Studios, signing off.